This is because the Cold War had already made distant lands battlegrounds, with superpowers fighting through proxies. The resultant or ongoing conflicts in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Angola intensified the strain. The struggle for ideological supremacy was no longer only on foreign soil, but threatened humanity's existence. Every year brought a new increase in the race for bigger, deadlier nuclear arms. The United States and the Soviet Union created arsenals with enough destructive capacity to destroy the world many times over. Deterrence became the name of the game, but what was the price? Fear gripped the world as nations lived under the constant shadow of annihilation. Would rational minds prevail, or was the world hurtling toward an inevitable catastrophe? What kept this dangerous balance from tipping over? And in a conflict where victory meant survival, could anyone truly win? On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the world was changed forever when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the blink of an eye, the rules of war were rewritten. The catastrophic damage brought the end of World War II for Japan, which surrendered, but it sent shivers down the spines of the world, specifically to the Soviet Union. It was no longer a theory in nuclear weapons, but rather the harsh reality capable of deciding the fate of a nation. For a handful of brief years, nuclear power was the privilege of the United States, used by the superpower as a strategic upper hand in the game of world politics. Then in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, which they had codenamed RDS-1. No longer was there a single superpower nuclear player. This event launched the real arms race. Both nations tried their best to top each other off in firepower. There was a mistake in the policy making. Fear of falling behind caused a nuclear stockpile to explode exponentially. When the US developed hydrogen bombs in 1952, the same thing came up with the Soviets in 1953, and it never seemed to abate. Each progress only fueled the cycle of escalation. The Cold War was no longer an ideological struggle, became a race of developing the most destructive weapons ever known to humanity. The question changed from who possessed nuclear weapons, but who had the most, and who could strike first. With tensions at the highest level known to man, mankind stood on the brink of destroying itself. When the nuclear race grew fierce, the concept was devised, a very harsh doctrine defining mutual assured destruction. If the superpower, for example, the US, used nuclear force, then there was the reaction of the so-called Soviet bloc, which made use of its respective nuclear forces. These attacks would destroy the whole world. Hence, theoretically, there could never actually be a winner from the nuclear war and should just never happen in the first place. To ensure deterrence, the US and USSR had accumulated staggering nuclear warhead stockpiles. In the 1960s, each side had thousands of bombs, exponentially more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki missile silos. Nuclear submarines and bombers all held ready at any given time. It was an easily understood strategy. If it became impossible to prevent the attack, at least they could retaliate before they were destroyed. The superpowers had reached a frightening balance, too powerful to be attacked and yet too frightened to disarm. But MAD was not just a military strategy, it was a psychological weapon. The threat of nuclear annihilation hung over the heads of leaders and civilians. Governments carried out doomsday drills, school children were covered under their desks, and bomb shelters became an everyday part of life. One miscalculation, a false alarm, or an act of desperation could set off the unthinkable. The world lived in fear, forever at the very precipice of destruction. Yet this fear prevented war. The remainder of the question was, how long would this grudging balance hold before the heavy boot of something or someone pushed the world beyond the edge? The world teetered on the edge of nuclear war than at any other point in history in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the ultimate confrontations the United States was to have with the Soviet Union. The drama was the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the US coast. That move shattered a delicate balance of power and pushed the world to its edge of being annihilated. For 13 agonizing days, the world held its breath as President John F. Kennedy squared off against Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in a standoff that seemed to be on the brink of a nuclear war. Kennedy insisted that the missiles must be withdrawn from Cuba, which Khrushchev argued was a defensive measure against threats from the US. The United States imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, effectively cutting off all Soviet shipments, with a clear signal that any attack launched from Cuba would bring full-scale retaliation. Behind closed doors, both realized that a wrong move could mean global destruction. A secret deal was reached. The USSR agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and a quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without war, but it marked forever the history that no war might ever be fought again. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying lesson in how quickly the tensions of the Cold War could spiral into catastrophe. In response, the US and USSR established a direct communication hotline between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. Arms control agreements soon followed, but the world had seen how fragile peace truly was. The question lingered. Would humanity's survival always depend on the restraint of a few men? And the shadow of nuclear war hung over the mundane life, assimilated by the culture. Governments, especially in the United States and the Soviet Union, used propaganda to build up the threat of nuclear annihilation as a dangerous threat that would finally require the military option. Bomb drills were all the rage in schools throughout the U.S. Children were taught to duck and cover under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. These drills meant to prepare the public for a nuclear attack on the country, instead fed a sense of vulnerability and fear. The nuclear propaganda films, the American Duck and Cover, and the Soviet A Day in the Life of the Worker continued to feed an atmosphere of dread. The enemy in both was an abstract, omnipresent threat. Such a culture created a sense of inevitable sudden, catastrophic destruction. In the United States, this was intensified by the Red Scare, with anti-communist rhetoric linking Soviet nuclear ambitions with a world campaign to conquer and dominate. In this propaganda, the USSR would be a mortal enemy, and nuclear buildup became essential to national survival. It kept society in constant fear of annihilation, leaving that generation anxious, distrustful, and paranoid. Living under the shadow of the bomb, many began to question the cost of peace and security. The tension about survival and obliteration defined the experience for those who survived the Cold War. It was an amalgamation of how they perceived not only the political landscape, but their place in a world tottering on the edge of destruction. While the nuclear race intensified throughout the Cold War, there were also heavy efforts to check the increasing danger of global annihilation. These included the major arms control treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, and the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. These accords were focused on reducing the nuclear stockpiles of the superpowers, with SALT Y and the Euronatos going for restrictions in the development of missile systems and warheads, while going on to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which ended testing in the atmosphere, underwater, or in space. These were major strides towards containing the immediate threats spawned by the arms race. True disarmament proved to be an unattainable dream. The US and the USSR persisted in their huge nuclear inventories, and the key was well-justified mistrust and a need for strategic advantage. These agreements tended to be quite hard to verify and comply with because they were very loose and full of loopholes. The promise of mutually assured destruction, MAD, often dominated efforts to reduce the threat in hard ways. Even with diplomacy at the forefront, achieving lasting stability in a world on the brink of nuclear war was fragile at best. Leaders recognized the dire consequences of total annihilation, but finding common ground amidst the ideological divide was a monumental challenge. While these treaties symbolize hope, the world remained perched precariously between conflict and peace, where arms control was as much about survival as it was about diplomacy. This kept the world on the edge, where one slip into destruction and possible power through nuclear armaments constantly overhung the international political trajectory. Every rocket firing, every warhead in production crept a little further down to that possible abyss. Was this, then, a guaranteed path to peace, or had deterrence based on nuclear energy set man once more to eternal servitude on a vicious spiral of mistrust and fear? Or maybe it is otherwise, whereby the Cold War tensions might be prosecuted differently, or are such types of existential threats always inevitable? And yet, while the world stands suspended and people breathe their last breath in anticipation of the unthinkable, one asks how much longer humans could live on in such an atmosphere of fear. What was it going to take to shatter this mutually assured destruction? Then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of annihilation more than ever before through a 13-day standoff. So how did the diplomats avert disaster?